This happened to me about 3 years ago when I was working the graveyard shift at a local warehouse. The pay wasn't amazing, but the overnight differential made it worth it, especially since I was trying to save up for a down payment on a house. I'd usually get home around 7 a.m. completely exhausted and sleep until mid-afternoon. The house next to mine had been empty for almost 8 months. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chung, had passed away, and her family lived out of state. They'd been trying to sell it through a realtor, but the housing market was slow, and the place just sat there. The lawn grew wild, newspapers piled up on the porch, until I started throwing them away myself, and the whole place had that abandoned look that made the neighborhood feel a little less safe. What made it even more unsettling was that Mrs. Chung had been the kind of neighbor who kept her curtains open and her lights on. Her house used to feel warm and lived in, even from the outside. Now it was just this dark, hollow shell sitting 20 feet from my bedroom window. I started noticing the TV first on a Tuesday morning. I'd just gotten home from work, and as I was parking in my driveway, I saw this faint blue glow coming from Mrs. Chun's living room window. At first, I thought maybe the realtor was showing the house early, or perhaps the family had finally come to clean it out. But there was no car in the driveway, and the blue light had that specific flickering quality of a television screen. I stood there for a moment, keys in hand, just staring at that window. The curtains were drawn, but they were thin enough that I could see the light changing, shifting between bright and dim like something was actually playing on the screen. I convinced myself it was probably just a reflection from my own house, maybe the sun hitting something weird, even though it was barely sunrise and overcast. But when I woke up that afternoon around 3 p.m., the light was still there. Same blue glow, same flickering pattern. I called the real estate agent whose number was on the for sale sign, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining that I was the neighbor and thought someone might have broken in, but I never heard back. That night at work, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept checking my phone, hoping the realtor would call back, but nothing. My coworker Jake noticed I was distracted and asked what was wrong. When I told him about the TV, he just laughed and said maybe Mrs. Chun's ghost was catching up on her stories. Real funny, Jake. But the next morning, the TV was still on. I decided to walk over and look through the window, just to see if I could figure out what was happening. The front yard was overgrown with weeds that came up to my knees, and I had to push through them to get close to the living room window. As I got closer, the blue light became more intense, and I could actually hear the faint sound of audio coming from inside. I pressed my face against the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block out the morning light. What I saw made my stomach drop. The TV was definitely on, displaying what looked like a news broadcast, but the living room was completely empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of furniture. The couch, the coffee table, the bookshelf, everything that had been there when Mrs. Chung was alive was gone. Just bare walls, worn carpet, and this old CRT television sitting on the floor in the corner, plugged into the wall, playing by itself. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The family must have cleaned out the house, but left the TV behind. That made sense. But why was it on? Why was it playing a news broadcast when there was no cable connected to the house? I knew for a fact that Mrs. Chun's family had canceled all the utilities months ago because I'd seen the electric company truck outside with a guy shutting off the power at the meter. I walked around to the back of the house where the electrical meter was located. Sure enough, there was a plastic lock on it, the kind the utility company uses when service is disconnected. But somehow that TV was still getting power and somehow still receiving a signal. I should have called the police then. I should have called the realtor again. I should have done something other than what I actually did, which was go home and try to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe the family had turned the power back on to show the house. Maybe they'd set up some kind of cable or streaming service to make the place look more lived in for potential buyers. People do weird things when they're trying to sell a house. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The news broadcast I'd seen through the window looked old, like it was from years ago. The graphics were outdated, and the anchors' clothes and hairstyles looked like they were from the early 2000s. Plus, the picture quality was that fuzzy. analog look that you don't see anymore now that everything's gone digital. For the next week, I developed a routine. Every morning when I got home from work, I'd check the window. The TV was always on, always playing the same type of old news broadcasts. Sometimes it would be weather reports, sometimes local news, sometimes what looked like public access programming. But it was always old content, always that same fuzzy, analog quality. I started taking pictures with my phone, thinking maybe I could figure out what station it was or when the broadcasts were from. But every time I tried to take a photo, the image would come out completely dark, like there was no light coming from the window at all. My phone's camera couldn't pick up what my eyes were seeing clearly. After about 10 days of this, I finally worked up the courage to call the police. I told them I suspected someone had broken into the abandoned house next door and was living there illegally. 2 officers showed up about an hour later, and I met them in the driveway to explain the situation. Officer Martinez was young, probably new to the force, and he seemed genuinely concerned. Officer Webb was older, more skeptical, and I could tell he thought I was wasting his time. But they agreed to check it out, and I walked them over to the living room window. The TV was off. The house was completely dark, exactly like it had been for the past 8 months. I stood there pointing at a black window, trying to explain that just an hour ago there had been a bright blue light and the sound of television audio, but now there was nothing. The officers looked at each other with that expression cops get when they think they're dealing with someone who's either lying or having a mental breakdown. Webb asked if I'd been getting enough sleep, working those overnight shifts. Officer Martinez was more polite, but he suggested that maybe I'd been seeing reflections or shadows, and my tired mind had filled in the rest. They did a quick walk around the house, confirmed that all the doors and windows were locked and secure, and left me standing in the overgrown yard feeling like an idiot. That night at work, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept checking my phone, waiting for something, though I wasn't sure what. Around 3 a.m., I got a text from an unknown number. It was just a photo, but when I opened it, I felt my blood freeze. It was a picture of me, taken from inside Mrs. Chun's house, looking through the living room window with my face pressed against the glass. The timestamp on the photo was from that morning when I'd gone to investigate. I immediately called the police again, but this time I got the night dispatcher, who took my information and said someone would call me back. No one ever did. When I got home that morning, I was too afraid to check the window, but I could see the blue light reflecting off the side of my own house. The TV was on again. I ended up staying at my sister's house for the next few days, too scared to sleep in my own home. When I finally came back, I hired a private investigator to look into Mrs. Chun's house and her family. What he found still keeps me up at night. Mrs. Chun had died in that living room, sitting in her favorite chair, watching the news. The coroner estimated she'd been dead for 3 days before anyone found her. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. The TV had been on the entire time. The neighbors had reported seeing the blue glow from her window for days, but everyone assumed she was just staying up late watching television, like she always did. The investigator also found out that Mrs. Chun's family had taken everything from the house except one item, the television. They'd told the realtor they couldn't get it to turn off, even after unplugging it, and they were too creeped out to take it with them. They'd asked the realtor to dispose of it, but somehow it had never been removed. I moved out 2 weeks later. I couldn't stand living next to that house, knowing that somewhere in that empty room an old television was still playing broadcasts from years ago, keeping watch over a place where someone had died alone. The new owners of my old house are a young couple with a baby. I wonder if they've noticed the blue light next door, or if they're too busy with their new life to pay attention to what's happening in the windows around them. Sometimes I drive by my old neighborhood just to check. The house still hasn't sold, and on cloudy days, if you look carefully, you can still see that faint blue glow coming from the living room window. I've thought about calling the new owners, warning them about what they're living next to, but what would I tell them? That their neighbor's TV won't turn off? That it's playing news broadcasts from when the previous owner was still alive? I found a new job with normal hours and a new house on the other side of town. But sometimes late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of blue light reflecting off my bedroom wall, and for just a moment, I'll think I'm back in that house, watching that endless, impossible broadcast from beyond the grave. I need to tell you about something that happened to me and my family last year. We just moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people keep their lawns perfectly trimmed and everyone waves when they pass each other walking their dogs. It seemed like the perfect place to raise our two kids, Emma, who was 7, and Jake, who was 5. Our next-door neighbor was a man named Dennis. He was probably in his early 50s, lived alone, and worked from home doing something with computers. I remember thinking it was nice to have such a quiet neighbor after living in apartments for so many years where you could hear every footstep and conversation through the walls. Dennis was friendly enough when we first moved in. He helped me carry some boxes, told me about the neighborhood, mentioned which garbage day was recycling. Normal neighbor stuff. But there was something about the way he looked at people when he talked to them, like he was studying them instead of just having a conversation. My wife Sarah noticed it too, but we figured some people are just naturally intense. The weird dreams started about a month after we moved in. At first, it was just me. I'd always been a pretty sound sleeper, rarely remembered my dreams, but suddenly I was having these incredibly vivid, strange dreams every single night. They weren't nightmares exactly, but they were unsettling. I'd dreamed that I was in my house, but it was slightly different. Rooms would be rearranged, furniture would be the wrong color, or there would be extra doors that led to places that didn't exist. In these dreams, I always felt like someone was watching me. I'd search through the house, looking for whoever was there, but I never found anyone. I'd wake up exhausted, like I'd been running around all night instead of sleeping. Sarah started complaining that I was tossing and turning so much. I was keeping her awake. Then Sarah started having weird dreams too. Hers were different from mine, but equally disturbing. She dreamed that she was standing in our backyard, but it was enormous, stretching out like a field, and she was looking for our kids, but couldn't find them. She'd call their names, but her voice would sound far away, like she was shouting into a tunnel. The kids were having strange dreams as well. Emma told us she dreamed that her bedroom walls were made of glass and people were walking around outside looking at her while she slept. Jake had dreams about a man sitting in his closet, just watching him. When we asked him to describe the man, he said he was wearing headphones and holding something that looked like a microphone. This went on for weeks. All 4 of us were having intense, memorable dreams every night, and we were all waking up tired and cranky. I started drinking more coffee just to get through the day, and Sarah was snapping at the kids over little things. We thought maybe it was stress from the move or something about the new house. But the dreams were so specific and strange that they felt like more than just normal anxiety dreams. One Saturday morning, I was working in the garage when Dennis came over to borrow a screwdriver. While I was looking for one, he started asking me about how we were all sleeping in the new house. He said he'd noticed we seemed tired lately and wondered if we were having trouble adjusting to the new environment. The question struck me as odd. How would he know we seemed tired? We weren't particularly social with our neighbors yet, and it's not like we were outside complaining about being exhausted. But I told him about the dreams, thinking maybe he'd have some insight about the house or the neighborhood. Dennis listened very carefully, nodding and asking specific questions about the details of our dreams. He seemed especially interested in the emotional content, asking things like how the dreams made us feel, whether we felt scared or confused or anxious. At the time, I thought he was just being a good neighbor, showing concern for our family's well-being. But then he started sharing information about our dreams that I hadn't told him. He mentioned that in my dreams, I was always looking for something, but never found it. He said Sarah's dreams involved searching for something important that was lost. He described Emma's dreams about being watched and Jake's dreams about the man in the closet with remarkable accuracy. When I asked him how he knew so much about our dreams, he just smiled and said that dreams have common themes, and he'd studied psychology in college. He suggested that maybe we were all feeding off each other's anxiety, creating a cycle of shared stress dreams. It sounded plausible, but something about his explanation didn't sit right with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Dennis's questions and his uncanny knowledge of our dreams. Around 2 a.m., I got up to get a glass of water, and as I passed by the window in our kitchen, I noticed a light on in Dennis's house. Not just a normal room light, but a bright white light coming from what looked like his basement windows. I'd never noticed that Dennis had basement windows before. They were small and positioned just above ground level, but they were definitely there, and there was definitely light coming from them. I could see what looked like the silhouette of someone moving around down there, but I couldn't make out any details. Over the next few nights, I started checking that window whenever I got up. The light was always on, and there was always movement in the basement. I began to suspect that Dennis was staying up all night, which would explain why he was always home during the day and why his house was so quiet. One evening, while Sarah was giving the kids a bath, I decided to walk over to Dennis's house and see if I could get a better look at what was going on in his basement. I told myself I was just being a concerned neighbor. Maybe he was having insomnia and needed someone to talk to. I walked around to the side of his house where the basement windows were located. They were partially hidden by some overgrown bushes, and I had to crouch down to see through them. What I saw made me question my own sanity. Dennis was sitting at a desk with multiple computer monitors, all showing what looked like video feeds. But these weren't security cameras or anything normal like that. The images on the screens were swirling, colorful, abstract patterns that seemed to move and shift like they were alive. Dennis was wearing large headphones and had several microphones positioned around his desk. Most disturbing of all, he was speaking into one of the microphones, and his voice was barely audible, but had this strange, hypnotic quality to it. As I watched, he would speak into one microphone, then switch to another, changing his tone and cadence each time. Sometimes his voice was deep and soothing, sometimes it was higher and more urgent. He was reading from what looked like a script, but I couldn't make out the words. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On one of his monitors, I could see what looked like a floor plan of a house. Our house. There were labels on each room: master bedroom, Emma's room, Jake's room, guest room. And there were small indicators that seemed to show when each room was occupied. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. Whatever Dennis was doing in his basement, it involved our house and our family. I needed to get back home and figure out what to do with this information. When I got inside, Sarah was just finishing up with the kids' bedtime routine. I waited until they were asleep, then told her what I'd seen. She was skeptical at first, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood what I was looking at, but when I described the floor plan of our house on his monitor, she became as concerned as I was. We decided to stay awake that night and see what happened. We set up chairs in our bedroom where we could watch Dennis's house without being seen. Around midnight, the basement lights came on and we could see Dennis moving around down there. About an hour later, both Sarah and I started feeling incredibly drowsy, despite the fact that we were wide awake and anxious just minutes before. I remember fighting the urge to sleep, trying to keep my eyes open, but it was like someone was physically pulling my eyelids shut. The last thing I remember seeing was Dennis's silhouette in the basement window, speaking into one of his microphones. When I woke up the next morning, I was in my bed, but I had no memory of going to sleep. Sarah was next to me, and when she woke up, she had the same experience. We'd both been forced into sleep somehow, and we'd both had the same dream. We were standing in Dennis's basement, watching him work at his computer setup, but we couldn't move or speak. We were just observers, trapped in our own dream, watching him manipulate our minds. That's when I realized what Dennis was doing. He was using some kind of technology to induce and record our dreams. The strange dreams we'd been having weren't random or stress-related. They were being planted in our minds while we slept. He was essentially using our family as test subjects for some kind of dream manipulation experiment. I called the police that day, but when they arrived, Dennis's house was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of everything. No furniture, no computer equipment, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. The basement was completely bare, with no evidence of the elaborate setup I'd seen through the windows. The police took a report, but without any evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested that maybe Dennis had been a renter who'd skipped out on his lease, or maybe he'd been planning to move and had been gradually taking his belongings, but I know what I saw. I know what he was doing to us, and I know that somewhere out there, Dennis is setting up his equipment in another basement in another neighborhood, finding another family to use as subjects for his twisted experiments with the human mind. We moved out of that house a month later. The dreams stopped immediately, and we've all been sleeping normally since then. But sometimes when I'm just on the edge of sleep, I'll hear a faint voice that sounds like Dennis, whispering words I can't quite understand, and I'll jolt awake, wondering if he's found us again. This story happened to me about 2 years ago, and I'm still not entirely sure I believe it myself. I was living in this old Victorian house that I'd inherited from my grandmother. The place was over 100 years old, with a creaky foundation and a basement that always smelled like damp earth and old wood. I'd been living there for about 6 months when I started hearing sounds coming from the basement at night. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe mice. Old houses make all kinds of noises, especially when the temperature changes. But these sounds were different. They were rhythmic, like someone was digging or scraping at something. The sounds usually started around 11 p.m. and would go on for hours. I'd lie in bed listening to this steady scraping noise, trying to convince myself it was just the pipes or the heating system. But deep down, I knew it wasn't anything mechanical. It sounded exactly like someone using a shovel, digging into dirt. My neighbor to the left was a guy named Carl. He was probably in his late 60s, lived alone, and kept to himself. I'd seen him working in his yard sometimes, but we'd never really talked beyond a polite wave. He seemed harmless enough, just a quiet old man who minded his own business. After about a week of hearing the digging sounds, I finally worked up the courage to go down to the basement and investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down the creaky wooden stairs, my heart pounding the whole way. The basement was dark and cluttered with boxes and old furniture from my grandmother's estate. But I could tell right away that something was different. In the far corner, behind a stack of old steamer trunks, there was a pile of loose dirt on the floor. Fresh dirt, not the kind that had been there for years. I moved the trunks aside and found a hole in the concrete floor, about 3 feet in diameter. It looked like someone had been chiseling and digging through the foundation from underneath. I shined my flashlight down into the hole, but I couldn't see the bottom. It was deeper than the light could reach, and it seemed to angle away from my house toward the direction of Carl's property. The edges of the hole were rough and uneven, like it had been carved out by hand with simple tools. I should have called the police right then. I should have called anyone, to come and look at this hole that definitely hadn't been there when I'd moved in. But I was scared and confused, and I didn't know how to explain what I'd found. How do you tell someone that your neighbor is digging a tunnel into your basement? Instead, I decided to cover the hole with a piece of plywood and wait to see what happened. I figured if someone was digging from Carl's side, they'd hit the plywood and maybe give up, or at least I'd hear when they discovered it. I moved the steamer trunks back in front of the covered hole and went back upstairs. That night, the digging sounds were louder and more aggressive than ever. I could hear what sounded like someone hitting the plywood with a hammer or pickaxe trying to break through. The noise went on for about an hour, then suddenly stopped. I waited for another hour, but there was nothing but silence. The next morning, I went back down to check the hole. The plywood had been moved aside, and the pile of dirt was bigger than before. Whoever was digging had broken through my makeshift barrier and continued working. But now there was something else in the hole, a wooden ladder, leading down into what was clearly a tunnel. I was terrified, but I was also curious. I climbed down the ladder using my flashlight to see where I was going. The tunnel was narrow, maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, just big enough for a person to crawl through. The walls were rough dirt, reinforced in places with wooden boards, and the whole thing smelled like earthworms and decay. The tunnel stretched for what felt like forever, angling slightly upward as it went. My knees were scraped, and my back was aching by the time I reached the end, but what I found there made all the discomfort worth it. The tunnel ended in another basement, one that was clearly much more modern than mine. There were concrete walls, overhead lighting, and what looked like a workshop area with tools and equipment. I climbed up into Carl's basement, trying to be as quiet as possible. The place was immaculate, organized like a professional workshop. There were shovels, pickaxes, woodworking tools, and what looked like surveying equipment. On a workbench, I found detailed blueprints of both my house and Carl's house, showing the exact dimensions of both basements and the planned route of the tunnel. But the most disturbing thing I found was a journal filled with Carl's handwriting. He'd been planning this tunnel for months, documenting every step of the process. According to his notes, he'd been watching me since I moved in, studying my routines, figuring out when I was home and when I was away. He knew that I worked late nights at the restaurant where I was a line cook, and he'd been timing his digging to coincide with my work schedule. The journal entries became more and more disturbing as I read them. Carl had been inside my house multiple times, coming through the tunnel while I was at work. He'd been going through my belongings, reading my mail, even eating food from my refrigerator. He wrote about how he enjoyed being in my space, how it made him feel connected to me in a way I'd never understand, but the most chilling entry was dated just 3 days earlier. Carl had written about how he was almost finished with his project, and how soon he'd be able to visit me whenever he wanted, not just when I was away. He talked about how he'd been practicing moving through the house silently, learning which floorboards creaked and which doors made noise when they opened. I got out of there as fast as I could, crawling back through the tunnel and up into my own basement. I immediately called the police and told them everything I'd found. 2 officers came to my house within an hour, and I showed them the tunnel and Carl's journal. When they went to arrest Carl, they found that he'd disappeared. His house was empty, but not in the way Dennis's house had been empty in the previous story. Carl's house looked like he'd left in a hurry, with food still in the refrigerator and clothes still in the closets. But he was gone, and so was most of his digging equipment. The police investigation revealed that Carl had been doing this for years, in multiple neighborhoods. They found evidence of at least 4 other tunnel systems he'd built, connecting his various rental properties to his neighbors' homes. In each case, he'd been secretly entering people's houses for months. Before anyone discovered what he was doing, they also found that Carl wasn't his real name. His actual name was Robert Finch, and he had a history of breaking and entering charges going back 20 years. He'd been using false identities to rent houses next to potential victims, then spending months digging tunnels to gain access to their homes. The worst part was discovering what he'd been doing in my house all those times I was at work. The police found evidence that he'd been photographing my belongings, documenting my daily routines, and even recording videos of me sleeping. He'd installed tiny cameras in my bedroom and bathroom, hidden so well that I'd never noticed them. I moved out of that house immediately. I couldn't stand the thought of living in a place that had been violated so thoroughly by someone I'd never even had a real conversation with. The new owners filled in the tunnel with concrete. But I heard from a friend who still lives in the neighborhood that sometimes, late at night, they can hear digging sounds coming from the direction of Carl's old house. Carl, or Robert, or whatever his real name is, was never caught. The police think he probably left the area entirely, maybe even the state. But every time I hear unexpected noises in my new house, every time I come home and something feels slightly off, I wonder if he's found me again. I wonder if somewhere beneath my feet, someone is digging their way toward my basement, counting the days until they can crawl up through my floor and make themselves at home in my life.